What's the link between software and your health? Hi, my name is Oded, and in this podcast I'll talk about software development in the field of medical device, pharmaceutical, and healthcare with industry-leading experts. Hello, Mr. Bijan Elahi. Thank you so much for participating in the podcast and agreeing to come for a conversation about risk management in software. Before we dive in, maybe you can introduce yourself shortly.
Hi, Oded. Thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. To give you a little background about myself, I am a systems engineer, a medical product developer, and an educator. I've spent the last 28 years or so in the medical device industry as a developer of Class 3 implantable pulse generators, such as pacemakers, implantable defibrillators, and deep brain stimulators. But I started my career in aerospace. My last job was at NASA, working on the space shuttle. How I ended up in the medical device industry was that in the 1990s, the medical device industry was in its early phases of maturity with respect to risk management. So they came to aerospace, which had decades of experience on this subject, and asked for help. And that's how I ended up in the medtech industry. Nowadays, I don't develop products anymore. I just teach and consult. I feel that this way I can deliver my highest and best value to the world. I also teach a graduate course at a technical university in Eindhoven to doctoral students in engineering, and wrote a book on this subject, which has become a bestseller for Elsevier Publishing.
A very unique point that you're noting that it originated from aerospace. Yes, so that's kind of
yes.
That reliability engineering of aircraft and maybe automotive, that's really the foundation for what we are seeing today in the medical device industry.
Yes, yeah. That's the origins of it came from aerospace.
So just before we start, maybe you can give us a brief description of risk management, and everything is based on the ISO, the 14971. Maybe you can also elaborate a bit about it.
Yeah, okay. ISO 14971 is the internationally recognized standard for risk management for medical devices. It lays out a framework for risk management and outlines a process that manufacturers can follow in order to show that their products are acceptably safe for commercial use. It's, by the way, not mandatory, but it's highly recommended, and most companies do follow it. The standard briefly describes some major groupings of activities that it expects, for example, risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, risk management review and monitoring the product performance after the product is produced and released. It's a kind of a high-level description, and it's a very common and popular standard used worldwide.
All right, and so let's go in and start asking what is the contribution of software to patient safety, and how do you see the role of software in that risk management space?
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of people are interested in the role of safety and software and safety of medical devices, understood because so many products nowadays have software. Every medical device presents some degree of risk. If a medical device has software, then chances are that it can have some kind of a contribution to risk. Imagine an X-ray machine. The amount of X-ray energy that's radiated to a patient is controlled by software. So an error in software can result in excess energy radiated to the patient, which could result in burns, injuries such as burns. Another example is, if you imagine a surgical robot that moves a cutting instrument inside of a patient's body. The software monitors the range of motion of this cutting tool and limits its motion within certain boundaries. Now, if the software has a defect or a failure in it, this blade could go out of bounds and could cause injuries. So this is how software can contribute to patient safety risks. Just a couple of simple examples.
Okay, but okay. So do you see it differently from, let's say, hardware electronics, or do you see a relationship between the way we should address software and hardware from a risk management perspective?
Yes, they are different. Software is a different entity. Our hardware can have random failures, but software, and sometimes, by the way, hardware has random failures because of aging. It just wears out. This is both true for electronic and mechanical hardware. Software is not the same. It doesn't wear out. So it's treated differently, but it is also a contributor to safety risks. You should know that, of course, not every medical device has software. For example, there are mechanical devices like catheters, but nowadays a lot of devices have software in them. Even some simple devices such as a digital thermometer would have software. And complex medical devices such as MRI machines or CT scanners, they would not be possible without software. Software itself can play many different roles in medical devices. Software, for example, could provide a therapeutic function, it could provide a monitoring function, or it could provide a supportive function. Sometimes even software by itself can be a medical device. SAMD or SAMD it's called. For example, there is software that analyzes radiographic images, like X-ray images, and renders a diagnosis. That is itself a medical device, even though it's just a piece of software.
But from a risk management perspective, do you see that categories of software, does it impact the risk assessment or?
Yes, it does. So if you have a therapeutic type of software, it has a direct effect on patient safety. Like that example of controlling the amount of X-ray energy. It has a direct effect on patient safety. If it has a monitoring function, it can have an indirect effect on patient safety. So if you have software that's monitoring either software or hardware to determine whether the device is operating in a safe region, and the monitor fails, and the device then goes out of the safe region, you would not know it because the software monitor is not functioning. There are other types of software like supportive functions, for example, software that transmits data, prints reports, or controls the brightness of the screen on the computer. That's also software, but that doesn't affect patient safety. So there are really three kinds. As I said, some that provide a therapeutic function, some that provide a monitoring function, and other things, I just call them supportive functions. Basically, that's everything else.
Right, and when we come to do later on, let's discuss mitigations. But when we come to do mitigations, these categories are very important for us to decide whether we need to do something about the risk or not.
Yes, yeah. You need to know the role of software in your medical device, the kind of function that is performing. You need to know all that before you can decide how to and to what degree to mitigate the risks. Yeah.
And the fact that the code of both those functionalities, it might be mixed in the same code base, does it affect the risk assessment in any way?
Yes. It's actually advantageous for a manufacturer to distinguish these types of software. If you mix it all together, then the safety classification of your software would be the highest classification. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a software architecture that has a number of software items. Let's say you have 10 software items, and one of them is of highest severity, class C, that let's say is the one that controls where the cutting tool goes inside of a patient. And then you have, say, two more software items that are perform a monitoring function, and then you have 7 others that don't do anything related to the patient safety. They just are supportive, maybe display controls or elevation of the device and so on. If you mix it all together, then you have to treat the entire software system as class C, which requires a lot more work, a lot more rigor, documentation. So it's advantageous for the manufacturer not to mix it together and bound the highest risk software, like the Class C software, separate from the rest. And that way they can spend their engineering resources on the highest class software and then not so much energy and resources on the lower class of software. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I'm trying to imagine that from a software architecture. I mean, do you refer it in the same embedded device? You can see there are two separate categories within that device. If it's an MRI machine or that's
yes.
So that's really like the risk-based approach is risk-based architecture. If you
yes, yeah. It's the smartest thing to do is to think about these things and architect your system in such a way that it allows you to segregate your highest risk software from your lowest risk software. If you don't think about it in advance and you just start writing software, it may be too late by the time you figure this out. And if you have written it all, it's all mixed together, and you say, well, I should start over now because I did not architect this properly. I can't just separate them now. It's all together. So it's you get the best value for your engineering resources by giving this a lot of thought in the beginning before you even start writing code and designing software.
So far, tell me if I'm correct. We discussed more of the risk analysis part. Before we go to the risk control, is there anything that you think that's important for developers or other engineers to keep in mind about the analysis stage?
Well, besides spending a good amount of time thinking about the software architecture, its functions, and distinguishing the high safety criticality software from the low safety criticality software, there are other things that also are useful for designers. They can use techniques such as defensive coding, good software practices. They can do static and dynamic analysis of the software before it's put into production. So there are a number of techniques that they can use. These are commonly used in even other industries like aerospace and automotive. Good software practices, basically, to make sure your software is less likely to have defects in it before you release it.
That's very insightful. So when you say defensive programming, you mean kind of clean code, like code that is easy to maintain, it's easy to read, is safe,
yes.
is less likely to have bugs. Or
Right. One of the smartest things that you can do if you want to design safety critical software is to avoid unnecessary complexity. The simpler, the better. Of course, you can't make it absolutely simple. You're limited by the functionality of the device. But if the designers are mindful of avoiding unnecessary complexity, that helps them. Not only makes the software less likely to have defects and bugs in it, but also it's easier to review and test.
Okay, and when we want to think about, okay, we kind of we took the intended use, we analyzed the risk at the design, and now we want to think about the controls. Can you tell us about that stage of risk controls?
Well, yes. Risk controls are the activities and designs and decisions that we make in order to control the risk of a device. If you're talking about software risk controls, and I think this is the subject of interest for your software, according to IEC 62304, the preference for risk controls is for software is for the risk control to be external to the software item that is being controlled. So let's say you have written a therapeutic piece of software and you want to make sure that it doesn't cause harm to the patient. You create a risk control that's external to this software, something outside of it that is monitoring this therapeutic piece of software to prevent it from doing harmful things. It's even further preferred if this external risk control is hardware. So if you have hardware that's watching software to prevent it from causing harm. But if you can't do it in hardware, you can also have software. And then the degree of separation that you can create between the risk control and the therapeutic software also matters. If you want to go to the extremes, what you would do is you put the monitoring software, so let's call it the risk control software, to operate on a separate microprocessor operate in separate regions of memory, so that there is no cross-contamination, so that if there is a bug in the therapeutic function, it doesn't contaminate and create a defect into the monitoring software. Remember, I told you that I used to be working at NASA at the space shuttle, and we did practice that. We had very different control and monitoring type of functions. So much so that we even not only use different computers, different processors, different memory, different computers, even completely separate. We didn't even have the same company program the two. We had one company program, the main controlling, and a completely different company program, the monitoring one, so that there's no possibility of any kind of a cross-contamination from one side to another. That is extremely expensive, so medical device companies can't afford to do that. But to the degree possible, segregation of the two types of software helps you be able to claim that you can have a software risk control that is external to your controlled software.
That's a fantastic story. It shows you how far you can go with those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the IEC 62304, and maybe you can, and you already discussed how it's a bit related to the ISO 14971, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more about how these two guidelines coexist.
Yeah, IEC 62304, which is about medical device software, makes normative references to ISO 14971. And normative referencing means that if you are going to comply to IEC 62304, you must also comply to ISO 14971. In fact, if you read 62304, you see multiple places where it makes references and mentions ISO 14971. If you want to see the relationship between these two, the nice place to look at is Annex C of IEC 62304 that does mapping between the two standards and how they relate to each other. There's not 100% overlap, of course. There are some things that kind of don't map. For example, in IEC 62304, we classify software in class A, B, and C. This terminology doesn't exist in ISO 14971. So in some areas, the mapping is weak, but in some other areas, the mapping is stronger.
Okay. Is there any? There's a point that I'm always struggling with is probability analysis or quantitative probability when it comes to software risk. Is it even possible to do that?
Yes, not always, but sometimes. IEC 62304 says that there is no consensus on estimating the likelihood of occurrence of a software failure. But if you have legacy software for which you have good historical data, it is possible that you can estimate the probability of software failure creating a risk. That's not usually available. Most people don't have that information. Even if they have collected, sometimes the quality of data is not good enough to be able to make a quantitative estimation. So the technique that is used then instead of trying to estimate the likelihood of a software defect is to assume the worst case, that the software defect is going to be there 100%, and do everything that you can to reduce the likelihood of a hazard manifesting because of that software defect. And you do this by following good processes. For example, in IEC 62304, they call this rigor. The rigors of software, the higher the classification, the higher the rigor. So class C, which is the highest class, describes the most risky software. For example, software that is controlling somebody's life. A pacemaker, for example, provides a heartbeat to people that don't have a heartbeat. If the pacemaker stops working, the person drops dead because they won't have a heartbeat. So that's the highest class of software would be class C. And for those, you apply the highest amount of rigor. And if you read through 62304, you see there's a lot more requirements for testing, review, documentation, and so on, compared to a class A. So that's That's how you can address it. So you don't try to estimate the probability. You just do the best that you can using the best amount of rigor to reduce the likelihood of software defects and risks.
Oh, you said just making the failure is just not acceptable. So you have to do to make a probability of 1. Let's say that you say for those critical one, unless you have the data.
Yeah, you said failure is not acceptable. The thing is that it is impossible to ensure that you won't have a software failure, especially in software of even moderate complexity, let alone high complexity. You cannot be 100% sure that the software will not fail. So what you can do is to try to reduce the likelihood of that failure from occurring. Well, how do you do that? Apply the best techniques, high rigor, basically everything that's possible that is within our capabilities to make that software as good as possible. But you can never say that this software is 100% safe.
Right. I understand. Okay, I want to take you to a related topic to the 62304 that describe the software development lifecycle also. Software developers generally believe that Agile is the right way to go, or more recently continuous delivery, or is it possible to use the Agile methods in safety critical software? And do you have any advice with that?
Yes, I think it is possible to use Agile methods to develop safety critical software, because Agile is just another method of developing software. Ultimately, the output of Agile is the same as the output of a traditional waterfall or spiral model of software development. You're trying to make a software system that works for your medical device and does the job that you expect it to do. You just have to make sure that a sprint doesn't adversely affect the risk controls that were put in place in a previous sprint. And because these things happen on a short time frame, I think likely the developers will know what they did in the previous sprint. If the time span between 2 sprints was, let's say, a year, it's possible that people may start forgetting what they did, but sprints are fairly quick, and I think Agile is a usable method.
So let's for example discuss. You gave an example of a system with 9 components. One of them was class C, and one was class B, and the other were less were lower risk. Yes, class A. Let's say that we put the software on the market and we see how the user use it with telemetry, and we recognize that we can change something here to make it more comfortable for the user. We want to make a small change. Does the risk management procedures as it defined in the IEC and in the ISO, do they support like this kind of small batches release that say, okay, we know what we changed, we know it doesn't have any impact, or do we have to go through a very bothersome process of going over all the risks and asking were they affected, and how do you see that?
Well, these kinds of changes that you describe happen all the time. So this is just a fact of life. They will happen. The wise thing to do with respect to risk management is that if you're going to make a change, do a change impact analysis. Ask yourself, does this change have a potential for affecting the safety risks of the device? If, as I mentioned earlier, if you were careful about segregating the safety critical aspects of your software from the non-safety criticals, you would say that the thing that I'm changing doesn't affect the clinical functions of the device at all. Maybe it changes one of the controls so that it's more comfortable, as you said, for the user. But other than that, it has no impact on the safety criticals. If you can show that you are not going to affect that, then you don't have to do the exhaustive testing and analysis of everything because of smart design and smart architecting. But if you have as they say, spaghetti code, everything is all one mess, and you're making a change, how do you know this change that you just did is not going to affect the entire behavior of the software? That's when you get in trouble of sometimes thinking you're doing a simple change, but you're actually adversely affecting the safety of your system.
Is it what they refer to when they say a risk-based approach or risk-based validation that you hear? Is it what you just described?
Not exactly. A risk-based approach means that you can apply more resources and more rigor to higher risk parts of your system. But to do that, you need to know what the risks are, right? So let's say if you have these 10 software items and you want to spend time on testing, if you know which one is the highest risk, if that we said that one software unit or item was class C, you would spend most of your testing resources and time on that one software item instead of on all 10. That's risk-based verification, risk-based decision-making in general about medical devices. And this is not limited to software. It's also applicable to hardware. Some parts of your system will not be as safety critical as the other ones. So you want to focus your energies on the more safety critical aspects.
Yeah, excellent. And you also, I want to ask you about some software types that are a bit different. Yes. So I will say them, and then you decide which one to take and in what order. But there's legacy software. There is a software from SOUP, like unknown pedigree or a third party. There is a software that we use that we created for the assembly and the testing in production. So there's three categories here of software: legacy, software that we use from third vendors in the device, and software that we use for the assembly and testing. Can you advise how, from a risk-based perspective, we should address each one of those types?
Yeah. For legacy software that you have developed yourself in the past, and maybe it's from years ago, and now you want to continue to use it, there are a number of activities that should be done. You should assess your post-market surveillance data from what you have in your history on how the software has performed in the past, and see how legacy software is getting used in the new system. Are you using it exactly the same way? Are you making some changes? Could there be any new hazards that are generated because now you're using an old software on a new device? And are there risk controls in the legacy software are they still valid for the new system? And then you do a gap analysis and compare what's required by IEC 62304 versus what's available right now for your legacy software. Then evaluate what's missing from your legacy software and whether producing the missing items would improve your product safety. So that's the activities you would do for legacy software. For SOUP, or software of unknown provenance, you explained what is the origins of this SOUP software, where did it come from, under what circumstances is it being used, because it could have different usages. And if a failure or unexpected result from SOUP could potentially contribute to a hazardous situation, you examine those. At a minimum, you have to evaluate any anomaly lists that are published by the supplier of the SOUP and determine if any of the known anomalies could potentially create a system hazard or lead to a hazardous situation. And then with respect to software that you use for production or testing, those pieces of software don't directly affect the patient. However, any defects in them could indirectly cause harm by allowing a defective product to escape. So those also deserve rigor of analysis and testing. You need to be able to trust that if your test rig says that this software is passed, then it really is passed. It's not that because the test rig was flawed. So you need to do validation of your production software as well. But doesn't fall under the domain of ISO 14971.
Thank you very much for your time. I would like to ask you if you can assist people with risk assessment issues, if they can contact you or follow your publications.
Yes, of course. I'm available if people run into difficulties or have questions about risk management, about medical devices. You can reach out to me. I'm available. You can go to my website, which is medtechsafety.com, one word without any www. You can also email me. My email address is Bijan, Bijan, at medtechsafety.com. If you have any questions and difficulties, just do reach out to me. You can also, another way is to just read my book. My book is available at all major booksellers such as Amazon. For example, if you go to Amazon and just type my name, Bijan Elahi, it'll pop up. You can also buy it directly from the publisher, elsevier.com. You can try both of them and see where you can get the best price. It's a popular book. People like reading it. They say it's easy to read, and also it gives you step-by-step instructions on how to do your work. I think you'd enjoy it.
Excellent. Yes, I read the reviews. They are outstanding, and I'm gonna ask my manager to purchase a copy. Okay, so thank you very much. And
you're welcome. Good talking with you, Oded.
Bye-bye.